From tracking Skylab to working in launch control for the Delta rockets, Dan Kovalchik has had a remarkable career working in the space industry, but like thousands of others, he's someone that few people will have heard of.
However, Dan has been writing about his experiences in the industry, and they're really insightful books, so we thought we'd ask him to join us to tell us some more.
How are we doing? Let us know your thoughts via our social media pages at Space and Things Podcast on Threads, Instagram, and Facebook, or via the contact form on our website.
And please consider joining us on patreon.com/Space and Things. But right now, it's time for episode 193 of the Space and Things podcast.
Oh my God! Unbelievable, but it is right this time.
This is the Space and Things podcast with Emily Carney and Dave Giles.
I'm Emily Carney.
And I'm Dave Giles, and welcome to episode 193 of our podcast. Now, we recorded this episode last week as I'm out of town this week visiting some friends, so unfortunately we don't have a What Caught Our Eye in Spaceflight section this week, but we still have something a little bit different for you. As we mentioned a few weeks ago, on the 9th of April, the final Delta IV Heavy rocket launched from Cape Canaveral, and it was not only the final launch of that rocket, but the final launch of the Delta family of rockets, which started launching on May the 13th, 1960. Although that first launch was a failure, more than 300 Delta rockets launched in total with a 95% success rate. They're being replaced by the Vulcan Centaur rocket, which is pretty good, so all is not lost. But we're sad to say goodbye to such an iconic family of rockets. So that got Emily and I talking, and she told me about a new book which is out about the Delta II rocket called Days of Delta Thunder.
And so today we're joined by the author of that book, Dan Kovalchik. I'll read out the author notes from that book. Dan can thank the 1973 Skylab launch for lighting the way to his first job, a technician in NASA's Spaceflight Tracking and Data Network. It was a position that allowed him to do a little globe-trotting and inspired the works Range Rats at Sea and the Devil's Ash Pit Ascension Island. Stints at the Johnson Space Center and the Kennedy Space Center followed before Kovalchik found his dream job at what's now known as Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. There, he became the first system administrator for the Delta II team's new Launch Control Center. Kovalchik last sat on console in 2018 and now watches rocket launches from his couch in Merritt Island, Florida.
While we could have just focused on his time working on the Delta rocket, you can see that there is much in his career worth talking about, so that's exactly what we did.
Greetings, Earthlings. We interrupt your regular programming to bring you an important message. It's time to crack on.
Welcome, Dan, and thank you for joining us on our podcast this week. So first, we like a good scene-setting question. Did you always have an interest in spaceflight, or did an interest in electronics and engineering lead you to your professional career in spaceflight?
All of the above, right? My father was both electrician and technician and TV repairman, and sometimes he had to bring his work home to me, and I watched him on his workbench. I liked the idea of the soldering iron. And I don't remember keeping track of rocket launches. I was born in 1950. We lived in a little town. We had two small schoolhouses. And I was in the 5th grade, and periodically the teacher would come in, grab a bunch of us, and take us downstairs to watch TV, where Alan Shepard was on the bed. I was one of the lucky ones. They pulled my class down when it was time for lifting. And I remember that vividly. And over the years, I've added color to my memory. Of course, he wasn't coloring. Naturally, being of that impressionable age and watching Alan Shepard, what a great time to be a kid.
Absolutely.
You have two previous books, Range Rats at Sea and The Devil's Ash Pit, the latter about your time at the tracking station at Ascension Island, one of the most remote places on Earth. So how did you get these unusual assignments and rather exotic locations?
So part of growing up when I did, this was before the tracking data relay satellite system, and we had to have a dozen tracking stations all over the world to keep in touch with the astronauts. So over the years, what I kept hearing was NASA tracking station, NASA tracking station. the one at Bermuda, the one at Guam and Hawaii, all the different around the world. And this, of course, to small town boy, to hear all these exotic locations. And then suddenly in my local newspaper, they were looking for people for NASA tracking stations. And so I applied for that because I just graduated with a 2-year degree in technology, and went to Pittsburgh for my interview, and they accepted me, and they said, okay, where do you want to work? And they lay down a world map with all the tracking stations in front of me around the world. I suddenly got cold feet. I couldn't go to Canary Islands, or I couldn't go to Hawaii. And so I just stabbed my finger down on Texas. There was the Corpus Christi station. They told me up front this was strictly for Skylab, and it was going to be a temporary assignment. And that worked out very well. Plus, I kind of thought that I would transfer to one of the other tracking stations. And indeed I did. I got to the United States naval ship Vanguard. By the way, it was a $30 million investment by NASA for the Apollo program. They took World War II tankers, and for $30 million a piece, they actually cut off the bow and stern. That's all they kept of these tankers, and filled it full of electronic equipment. And ironically, they used the 3 ships only once. Then they said, we don't need 3 ships. $60 million that they didn't have to spend, $60 million in 60s money. Anyway, it continued. NASA kept it on for its various projects. And for Skylab, they went to port in Mar del Plata, Argentina. And that's where, by the way, this being the mid-70s, women were starting to take unusual roles, or what's the word?
Unprecedented?
Unprecedented roles, thank you. So there were 2 girls, Karen Wright, who actually had a technical degree but couldn't find a technician in Maryland, for heaven's sake. And so she's working as a secretary. And then another girl was Gloria Tucker, who did have secretarial skills, and she was working pretty much in that capacity, while our overseas manager, Ben Gallup, wanted to break the barriers. And so he found these 2 girls, and I say girls because they were 22, 23, and asked them, well, they came to him looking for a job and wanted to go to, they picked the Vanguard. So they made it, and what a time that was for them. They have their own stories, being that they're in Mar del Plata, they're in port, and their first night on the ship, there's explosions. They were worried about terrorism. They were worried about strife in Argentina, and so periodically, hand grenades in the water in port, and these 2 girls in their stateroom, and just listening to explosions on their first night away from home. And that was a difficult night. Anyway, one of those girls, I liked her more than the other girl and married her. And so on the wall behind me, I have, there are 4 certificates. 2 of them are equator crossing certificates, and 2 of them are round the world certificates. So my dream, my Western Pennsylvania dream of traveling around the world did come true.
Fantastic.
In a way that I never could have imagined. And then the Vanguard went away. Ships are very expensive to operate and maintain. And so they closed it up for a while. And my new girlfriend and I got married after we got off the ship, and actually took a job in Ecuador, another tracking station. That was a tough assignment. And while we were there, actually my wife got sick and we were broke. We decided the best thing for her to do was to leave Ecuador, get out of the land of the parasites and so forth. It was a very difficult health situation. But at the time, we were also going broke. We always heard about Ascension Island, how that was a place to make money. You live there for free, just like we lived for free on the Vanguard. They fed us and housed us. And so same thing on Ascension. Plus, there is a tax break on Ascension Island. If you stayed there 18 months, you wouldn't have to pay federal income tax. We thought, well, rather than you going back to Maryland and taking some piddly job, why don't you go to Ascension? So she agreed. And so there she was, another groundbreaker, and went to Ascension Island. But she wasn't so much a groundbreaker there. There were women on Ascension, not a lot, still in the realm of 1 to 100. I another 9 months or so in Ecuador. They did not assure me that I would be able to go to Ascension either. We both sweated it out, but as it turned out, Ben Gallup came through again, and our overseas manager, and he did send us to Ascension, and there for 3 years. Had a great time, as great a time as you can be when you only have about, I don't know if it was 8 miles across the island or some such thing. And that just meant you could try out the different beaches. I lived in the water. Unfortunately, my wife did not. And as much as I tried her to go snorkeling and so forth, she was just too afraid. She had heard too many stories in the 6 or 9 months that she'd been there by herself, listening to all the bravado from the other males there talking about their diving experiences and moray eels and sharks and so forth. She just did not like to go in the water, and didn't want me to go into water either, but she put up with it. After 3 years, we said, that's enough. And in fact, technology was passing us by. I noticed that we had some equipment there. We had some telemetry equipment that it was in various configurations. It was 3 or 4 racks of equipment. I never knew really what it was, but they called it a Misfit 2 and a Misfit 3, manned space telemetry processor is what that stood for. Only a few years ago did I find out what that was. And it was a bit synchronizer and a decom. And what it did was it took the telemetry stream from the spacecraft and figured out the ones and zeros. So it took, in those days, 3 or 4 racks of equipment to figure out a telemetry stream. When I retired, we had a personal computer that had a board in it that had that bit sync arm took up 3 or 4 racks. It was now on one chip. And one chip went on this card, and the card had room for 63 more chips. You could 64 bit syncs and decoms in a PC size box that used to take 3 or 4 racks of equipment to do the job in the 70s and in the 80s as well, because they didn't throw those racks away when they first launched the shuttle. They still used those tracking stations. It is just astonishing to know that we were still doing manned spaceflight in the 80s using the technology on these tracking stations.
That is crazy. So, to my knowledge, you were the last person to send a command to Skylab, which we know is the first U.S. space station. Holds a special place in our hearts on this show. So tell us the story about that and how the space station was actually re-entering when you sent this command. That, to me, is just, wow.
Well, that was my big regret. I did not send that command. I had a trainee. And we called them passes. For every pass that we had that day, I was letting him send commands to other satellites, and I was showing him how to do the job. And Skylab, it was not just another pass. It was not just another list of commands to send. And I badly wanted to push him aside and take over. But it had been his job all day. And so I just very politely let him do it, and regretted it ever since. But it did get, we heard from our radar people, they could determine that even though it was breaking apart, Skylab was breaking apart at the time, but it did accept the command.
Wow.
And do what it was supposed to do. We had some pretty robust hardware in orbit at that time, I guess. And that's the last we heard of it, because it took some time for news to get to Ascension. And generally had to wait a week or so to read all the newspapers and Time magazine. And I think it was in Time magazine where I read that it was over Santiago. They had done something over Santiago and gave them the credit for sending the last command. And I said, well, I know better, even though it wasn't me.
Can we just go back to your time on Ascension Island then? So when you were there, part of the tracking station, you just said things took a lot of time to get to you. How did it work when you had to get some information up to a spacecraft? How did they get the information to you to do that in a quick enough amount of time? What was the systems in place there?
Well, I think there was a little bit of cooperation. There were Brits, Yanks, and Saints on the island.
Right.
And the Brits were there first from Napoleon's days.
Of course.
What happened was Napoleon was on St. Helena, exiled on St. Helena. And in those days, the way you navigated was to either hug the coast and then find the right latitude, longitude, and make an adjustment, or and you find an island. Well, coming from France, the first island you would hit before St. Helena would be Ascension. And so they figured that if somebody's going to come and rescue Napoleon, they have to find Ascension first and then go from there. And so they put a contingent of Royal Marines on Ascension. And that, oh my God, did that have to be the worst duty in the world? And I read some reports that it was. They made two towns, Georgetown and Two Boats were the names of the towns. And then starting in World War II, we, the Yanks, went there and created an airfield, actually to do submarine hunting. So probably around this time, I'm guessing that's when they went to St. Helena and brought back a workforce of Saints to come up to Ascension. So now all that's in preparation to saying, now comes the Apollo program, and we needed a way to communicate with Goddard Space Flight Center. And so we actually did a little cooperation with the Brits and paid them to build a communication station. They had their own dish network. You could see how this was just probably a rather political thing, I think. Yeah. Here we are building a NASA tracking station, and we don't have the capability to do satellite communications to Goddard. Well, of course we did, but we maintained happy relations. And so we had now I remember, we just called it the station, and it was completely built and run by the British. And so our communication was down the hill to the British station, and then up to satellites, and then on to Goddard Space Flight Center, and gave us all they would send us a teletype message. Right. And so they'd say, here's the commands we want you to send. Here's the expected location to point your antenna, so forth like that.
A teletype message.
Oh, yes.
I haven't heard about one of those in a minute. So that's pretty wild. So we're going to pivot here. Let's talk about your newest book. It just got released, I think, last week. It's called Days of Delta Thunder, and it opens with one of the most, I think, terrifying episodes in space history, because I remember this, the Delta II explosion that imperiled many workers at Cape Canaveral in 1997. So you survived this incident, but your car did not. So tell us what it was like to be in the blockhouse when this happened. This is just a wild story.
In my case, I was blissfully ignorant. After all, I was in a blockhouse. I was, yes, door to the rocket, only a few hundred feet away. And I can't remember the distance, but of course it was way too close. But it had successfully launched for all those years, ever since 1960. I always say they built the blockhouse back when the rocket was a telephone pole. It kind of grown considerably in size and power since then. It still had the basic Thor booster, essentially, but adding on those, they kept adding on solid rocket motors and extending them and making them bigger and more powerful. So I was just thinking that we're going to be, no matter what happened out there, we were going to be all right in the blockhouse, even though we were hearing some. There was one explosion in particular that was probably a couple tons of solid rocket fuel hitting the corner right on the edge of the blockhouse. When I found out later how close that was to an actual opening in the blockhouse. That was a sobering experience to see how close I could have come there, because there would have been no escape from that, not at all. Big explosion, by the way, that happened. There were two main rooms to the blockhouse, and the people in the front room were the ones that were closest to that blast. And I had heard that just as the rocket exploded, the propulsion engineer, Andy Hout, the highest respected, most experienced person in propulsion, who had been watching rockets, launching rockets for the longest, he said, "This is bad." And he dove under his console. Beside him were a couple of electrical people, and they were Joe Knight and Dave Wellman, who had actually been college roommates. And here they were working together years later. They looked at each other and they said, "Do you think that will help?" And they decided not. And for a while, it was just dark because, of course, we had no windows. And so we didn't know what was going on outside. But the television link was knocked out. And then when it was restored, we saw just a lot of smoke. And I don't remember seeing actually that much fire. We were pointed in the wrong direction to see fire. And if there was any, there was so much smoke, it blanked out the fire. The fire was actually behind us more than in front of us, because we were fortunate that the explosion was of such a force that it blew out beyond us. There was a ring of fire beyond us that, in fact, there was a part in the procedure that says, okay, remove all government cars back to the safe area. It was only about another 100 yards. Well, safe area turned out to be hazardous area, because had they stayed where they were, they might have got some shrapnel damage, something like that. But instead, solid rocket fuel landed directly on them.
Oh my God.
They moved to the wrong place. But after the explosion, then there was just the gradual creeping in of smoke. We are just looking at our screens. The screen's getting a little foggy, a little smoky rather. After 2 hours, I finally look up and see the level of smoke that was starting to come down, a layer of smoke from the ceiling down. And then I heard later there was quite a bit of the smoke worse in the front room, because that's where the sort of a crawl space where a cable tray came in from the outside. And it had unfortunately taken a direct hit of burning solid rocket fuel and set the whole cable tray afire. The cable tray acted like a chimney flue, and directed the smoke directly into the blockhouse.
Wow.
But the timing was right. The emergency crews came and opened the blast door. So we made it out and saw the destruction around us.
Wow.
And then we took a long way around the base to exit, and I looked over and I saw, raging fire in the parking lot. That was the worst of the damage that we saw. And I had to wait like a month or 6 weeks before the Air Force would allow us to go back to that area. And now I forgot what my car looked like. It's not that I forgot that. I forgot the nuances. How do you tell one burned out rusted Hulk from another? There's no seats. There's no steering wheel, nothing hanging from the rear view mirror. So it took me a while to find my car, and I did, and picked up a piece of the melted aluminum rim to bring home to my 7-year-old daughter for show and tell.
I love that. Right, before we carry on with more about the book, I want to back up a bit here. How do we go from Ascension Island, briefly, how do we go from Ascension Island to you working on Delta? I feel like we've skipped a step here.
Well, we skipped a couple steps there.
Right.
Another rewind. Partly you say, well, I've had enough of boredom. There were only so many things to do. Remember, this is back before internet. And
yeah,
a friend of ours found that Johnson Space Center was looking for people. And for this shuttle they kept talking about that we only periodically read about. Here we were, you think, hey, NASA tried. And you know everything that's going on. We knew very little of what's going on.
Wow.
So a friend of ours got the job. And she left Ascension, and she got there, looked around, saw that there were plenty more jobs, recommended us. It turned out to be a perfect time to be working on a tracking station, because the people at Johnson Space Center, they wanted people with tracking station experience so that they knew how to talk to the tracking stations and how communications worked. So my wife and I both got offers to Johnson Space Center. And imagine leaving Ascension Island. We did have cars on the island, but maybe there were 100 cars. And if we would go for a drive for ourselves, if we saw another car on the road, that was irritating. It was irritating to share the road with another car. I'd pull over and wait for that car to go around the next volcano. There were about 40 extinct volcanoes on this island of 30 square miles, something like that. So you didn't have to wait long for it to go around a volcano. And then I'd get back on the road. We leave that type of environment and we go to Houston. Oh my God, what an adjustment. And imagine pulling over because there's too many cars on the road. We're going to wait for all those cars to get out of the way. Anyway, we both got jobs there and loved our jobs. I ended up working for Ed Findell. We were just surrounded by all these Apollo people. And I had such a huge case of imposter syndrome. I still only had my 2-year degree. I was still a technician. And here I was working with not only engineers, but Apollo engineers. And not just engineers, but lawyers too. Some guys had degrees in law that I was working with, and master's degrees. I was just so intimidated by everybody there, and had, as I said, a bad case of imposter syndrome. And yet here I was it was building 4, and I can't remember which floor the astronaut offices were. We were on the bottom floor, and the vending machines were there. I go to the vending machine and I wait for Judy Resnick for selection. And then I make my selection, and then I go to a meeting, and a meeting with 10 people in it. And always 1 or 2 astronauts are in these meetings. And I'm in the stairwell, and Alan Shepard is in the stairwell, and I'm just too intimidated all the time there. I never intentionally talked. I talked to an astronaut by accident a couple of times. Not realizing they were astronauts. And probably if I had known, I probably would have stumbled and mumbled. But working with Ed, I don't know if you have any personal experience with Ed Findell, but he was kind of famously profane. And I was astonished when I first heard him talking on the loops, on the communication system, swearing. And I could not believe that. And here I am. I was in ground control first, and then I took a job in flight control, thinking I would not actually be working for him. No, I worked for him. He was the one that handed out the orders. I remember him coming in the office one time. I was still rather new, and I said, Ed, I had a question about that assignment, and he cut me off, and he said, about the new procedure I told you to write? No. It's about the database change I told you to make? No, it's about what the hell is this conversation all about? And I said, Ed, we haven't had a conversation yet. And I was so afraid of him. Like I said, he would always fly off the handle. And I was so afraid. And yet I had to say that. And he smiled and listened. And I asked my question. We made it through. And we got along very well after that. He was a fun guy to work for after that. I found out actually he stuck up for his own people. All that swearing on the network, that was to other departments. Boy, as I said, I was just so intimidated by everybody on console over there, the things that they were able to do. But at the same time, that led me to pay a lot more attention to my studies. And I went to University of Houston, Clear Lake campus. And so I went for my 2-year degree to get my 4-year degree there, which was a very good thing because there was no way that we could go to the Kennedy Space Center without a degree. They were so, I don't want to say lenient at Johnson Space Center, but they were much more understanding, much more practical to hire people with the appropriate experience. You take that experience to Kennedy Space Center, and they, at least the jobs that I was looking for, and
to have a degree. So naturally, I went to get a degree and find out what all this other education was all about. And being, imagine the technology that was popping up at this time in the early 80s. Then it quickly became apparent that I needed my degree so we could get out of Houston. Oh, did we hate the city of Houston? If I go to a movie, it seemed like there was a million people going to the same movie. I said, let's try this new restaurant. A million people going to a new restaurant. And it was just so crowded. And as I said, coming off of Ascension Island,
Yeah.
you can imagine what a culture shock to be in the United States. Oh boy! Speaking of which, actually coming back and going to a grocery store, and that's when they were reading barcodes. What happened to the lady with the cash register punch buttons and so forth? In 3 years that we'd been overseas more than just the 3 years on Ascension, but to come to all these advances in technology. And that leads me into why I spoke so much of technology in my book. When I went from Johnson Space Center to Kennedy Space Center, the first equipment they showed me, I walk in and I hear the teletype again. Wait a minute, we're on the second or third year of shuttle flying, and going in to a control room that's testing Space Lab payload that would eventually fly so many times on the shuttle. But we were testing it with a computer that I think it was a serial number 4 or something like that from a French company. And we talked to it with a teletype and a card reader and a paper tape reader. Oh, I was just devastated. So walk into that control room and be thrown at old technology again. I thought we were getting a little smarter. But while I was at the Kennedy Space Center, then a few years later, then they were making a new group called the Partial Payload Checkout Unit. And indeed, now they were moving away from the old stuff and getting into the new technology. And that's when I said, I'm getting out of the paper tape, and I applied, got my transfer to the Partial Payload Checkout Unit. As we were testing the payloads, that's when Space Station was still not settled. There was so much controversy for so many years about whether we should have a space station or not, and manned spaceflight in particular was scaring me. And so number one, I was worried about the space station, and number two, I was worried about manned spaceflight. We had gone through Challenger, certainly, and I can't remember if Columbia had happened yet. I decided that my best bet was to look for another job. And when I saw that the Delta people were hiring, now we were McDonnell Douglas at the time, they were another branch of McDonnell Douglas, but they were across the river, as we say. The Banana River separates the Kennedy Space Center and Cape Canaveral Air Force Station. And so when I saw that they needed some, and boy, not only did they need somebody, but they needed a system administrator. I jumped at the opportunity and only found out later that they considered, the Delta people, they considered system administrator to be temporary duty. They figured that the system that they were buying, that they had contracted for, was just going to be the perfect system, and just going to use people just like they had been using to turn it on and turn it off. My tenure as system administrator was supposed to be a short one that went from 95 to 2014.
Wow.
Wow.
All right. We did ask about the Delta II incident in 1997, but overall, the Delta program, granted, the beginning of the program did not have the same heritage as the ending of the program. I want to make that very clear to people. But the Delta program just wrapped up after 60 years. So what do you think its legacy is, despite some of the bumps, bruises, and blow-ups that were encountered during its very long run?
I told myself, as part of my reasoning, or trying to come to terms with the end of my career and what happened to everything that I had worked on. So as a system administrator, all the things that I had done to make the system more usable this was a big failing with the designers. They didn't think about the users. Actually, they didn't think how it would use the system and to get that data that they were so always frantic to receive. But I devoted my time to making it easier to get this data and helping out the users, all the console operators. We had one launch control system for the Delta II and a very similar one for the Delta IV, a little truly bigger, more capable. And within a year of my retirement in 2016, the Delta IV launch system was no more. They exchanged it because of our alliance, because the United Launch Alliance was an alliance between the people who launched Deltas and the people who launched Atlas rockets. Atlas, unfortunately for Delta, had developed their own system, their own launch system in-house. We, Delta, had paid others, an outside contractor, to develop ours. And in 2016, we were still paying that outside contractor for maintenance and operation of, just maintenance of our system. So with this alliance, the natural money-saving thing to do was to get rid of one, have one common launch system, and makes sense for the people who were performing on the console as well.
Yeah.
Well, when that happened, everything that I'd worked for in Delta IV was gone. All the tools that I'd made, every procedure I had made was gone. It's like I had never worked there for the last launches and right up this very last Delta IV launch. I had nothing there. When I was thinking of that, that's pretty disheartening that everything I'd worked on. But wait a minute, that was the ground-based stuff. That's unimportant stuff. What I really worked on was a method to put the stuff in the sky. So looking back, the thing that I had done since 1995, when I went over to Delta II, that's my legacy. I'm talking. You asked about Delta legacy, and that's Delta legacy too. It's okay. It's actually okay to forget the rocket. You can look at it. It's in the history books. Okay, the rocket's in the history books, and what I did is in my own personal history book. But what I accomplished and what Delta accomplished, and when I say I mean we. What a team we had. What we accomplished was all the GPS, for heaven's sake, GPS and all the communication satellites, the missions to Mars, for heaven's sake. That was a favorite moment in The Martian, when the Martian goes looking for Pathfinder, and you can bet that everybody on the Delta program said, "I know what he's looking for. He's looking for Pathfinder." That was so cool. So unbelievable to be a part of that.
What made you want to write this book?
A variety of reasons, I guess. One thing, I had time.
Yeah.
With my other two books, I was squeezing it in a little bit. And it's after retirement. You take a different perspective of your life, and I was trying to justify what I had done over my career. You kind of start thinking about it and thinking about writing it, and knowing that we, the Delta team, did something out of the ordinary, right?
Yeah.
And interesting. Our environment at ULA, United Launch Alliance, when you retired, you got a book to take with you, like a coffee table book. And I opened it up. I said, "Boy, this is great! A little memory capsule." And I opened it up, and it was a picture of a rocket launch. And page 2 was a rocket launch. And page 3, there's 50, 60 pages of rocket launches. There's nobody on console. There's nobody standing by watching. I thought that was a tremendous oversight. What about a little picture of us on console? How about the people that I've worked with all this time?
Yeah.
I wanted to bring these people who launched the rockets. I wanted to bring them into the fore. And let people know that there are other space programs besides manned space and SpaceX.
This was really amazing. Thank you for talking to us. And this is really cool to hear about this side of space flight. This was really cool. Thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you for being kind. Thank you for being gentle.
Absolutely.
Thanks for being part of our show.
Coming at you faster than Skylab falling down on Australia. This is the Space and Things podcast.
I found that interview incredibly fascinating. I've known Dan for a while, just off of Space Hipsters. I love talking about Skylab with him. Shocker. But I really love, I have the book. I'll be honest, I haven't read the entire book yet just because I've been busy and I've been torn in a million different directions. But I have the book Days of Delta Thunder. I am really enjoying it thus far because what Dan touched on this in the interview. You see, rocket launches, right? And, I'm sure as time goes on, we're going to hear more about the Delta program, kind of like how when the Titan program wrapped up so many years ago, you look back at that program with nostalgia. There's videos on YouTube about it, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm sure as we get further from the conclusion of Delta, we're going to see stuff like that, even though the Delta hardware changed a lot over 60 years. It wasn't the same rocket, at the beginning to the end by any stretch. But you see rocket launches, you see pictures of rocket launches, but you don't hear about the people who are sort of working behind the scenes, because they're not made into superstars. Maybe the only person you hear about is Tory Bruno, right? Which that's not a diss. I'm not dissing Tory Bruno. I want to make that very clear. That's not a diss at all, but he's the CEO of the company. He's more public facing, which is fine. But you don't hear about people like Dan or people who, really worked to get these rockets off the pad. You don't really hear their perspective, especially when stuff does not go as expected. The beginning of this book is incredible. As I touched on during the interview, Dan lost his car during that Delta II incident in 1997. His car, along with many other people's cars, were melted into the ground.
Crazy.
Pretty much. I'm not laughing because it's funny. I do not want that happening to my car by any stretch of the imagination. But yeah, I've seen photos and film of it, and it's really something that has to be seen to believed. It's unbelievable how destructive that explosion was. I'm very glad nobody was injured in that. Like we also said during the interview, there were people in the blockhouse. There were workers in the blockhouse during that. Very glad that nobody got hurt. That was bad. That was not a good thing that happened that day. But I think what Dan was doing with opening the book with that was basically telling us, you think about people working at the Cape, you think of people with hard hats and maybe, checklists and stuff like that. You think about that kind of imagery. You don't really think about these people are putting their lives on the line for these programs. I mean, they really were. I mean, it was very dangerous where they were. And I don't think people appreciate that much. And also just the fact, the sheer work that they do as well. I mean, you hear about Dan's entire career. He went from being sort of a range rat, as he calls himself. He started sort of small. He goes to work on the space shuttle. That's pretty big. And then he goes to work on, the Delta program for the rest of his career. I mean, it really speaks to, sort of the longevity of people in these careers and all the different things they work on as well. So I hope my comments made sense, but I find it fascinating. And again, Days of Delta Thunder, I'm reading it now. I'm really enjoying it just because I'm like, I've never heard of these stories. I love hearing things that are just untold, things you haven't heard before. It's very important for the historical record. I hate being an advertiser, but if you like that stuff too, I think you will enjoy it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I haven't read it, so I'm looking forward to reading it and finding out more about it. I think you nailed it there. I'll try and summarize what you just said there in these 2 points. One, it's great to hear stories from behind the scenes of a program where we normally only see images of the rockets. And two, it's incredible to hear of someone's career who has been around for so much of spaceflight history, but not normally near the front-facing part of it. So someone who has lived on Ascension Island for a year and a half, 3 years,
right?
And what they had to do there. To hear stories from someone like that, and then the culture shocks of coming back to Houston after that, and what that was like.
And seeing the highway and cars. Like, I don't drive in Houston, and I'm accustomed to driving in a city, and I will not drive in Houston, okay? Imagine going from Ascension Island, where there's very few cars, to going to Houston. I think I would drop dead. I would really do. I'd be like, oh, this is too much for me, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's why this is such a cool story to have heard. I think it was a great interview, and I think it's much bigger than I thought it was going to be as well. I think hearing someone's... How can you summarize one person's career in one small interview when they've been around for so much of it? And I think Dan did a great job of trying to show us what that was like. And I'm looking forward to reading the book, that's for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. You will enjoy it.
Anyway, I will put information about the book in the show notes, as well as a link to that video of that Delta explosion that Emily and Dan both talked about, and other things as always. You can find the show notes at spaceandthingspodcast.com or by clicking the link in the description of this podcast on your podcast provider.
Please leave us a review or share our podcast with your spaceflight loving friends. This is Space and Things Podcast.
Thanks for joining us this week. We said at the start we don't have a What's Caught Our Eye in Space section this week as I'm visiting friends up north, but we'll have more of that next week for you.
Yes, and thank you as always to our Patreon subscribers. It's nice to see that people are still signing up. Even though we reached our episode 200 goal, the more people who join gives us the power to try and do even more things with this podcast. So if you haven't already, please do go and check it out. You can do this at patreon.com/space and things. We'll be back with more Space and Things next week, but until then, don't forget, in space, no one can hear you me.